I can't help but cry for poor Charles. That's not my line. That's from a real person, typing through what sounds like genuine grief for a king who died in 1700, a man they never met, a man whose own family destroyed him before he ever drew his first stuttering breath. Hold that thought, because right now I want you to picture a farmer. Just some guy. Muddy boots, calloused hands, standing in a field somewhere in 13th-century England, petting a horse. And this farmer, this illiterate, land-working, manure-shoveling nobody, knew something that the most powerful royal dynasty in European history either didn't know or didn't care to know for over 150 years. You don't breed cousins. That's it. That's the whole thing. A pig farmer in 1350 understood that if you mated a sow to her own sire, the piglets came out smaller, weaker. Wrong. A stable hand in Andalusia knew you didn't cover a mare with her own son because the foals would come out with crooked legs. English manorial records from the 1200s and 1300s document the purchase and deliberate exchange of breeding animals between estates. Not as some cutting-edge innovation, but as basic, obvious, everyone knows this husbandry. Villages across Europe practiced what was called walking a bull, leading a breeding bull from farm to farm, village to village, specifically to introduce fresh blood into local herds. Germany, France, England, Spain. Everywhere. Because everywhere people raised animals, they could see what happened when you didn't. The lambs came out dead. The foals couldn't stand. The calves were born deformed. No microscope required. No genetics textbook. Just eyes. And then there's the Kazakhs. God, the Kazakhs. This is the part that makes the whole Habsburg saga go from tragic to genuinely infuriating. The Kazakh people, nomads on the Central Asian steppe, a culture the Habsburg courts wouldn't have given a second thought, developed a marriage prohibition system called zheti, 7 ancestors. The rule was absolute. Before any couple could marry, both families had to verify that the bride and groom shared no common ancestor within 7 patrilineal generations. Not 2, not 3, 7. Every Kazakh child was expected to memorize 7 generations of paternal ancestors as a basic civic duty, as fundamental as knowing your own name. Community elders enforced it. No exceptions. This tradition stretches back centuries, possibly over 1,000 years, deep into the steppe nomadic cultures that predated the Kazakh Khanate's formation in the 15th century. It survived the Mongol Empire. It survived Russian imperial rule. It survived Soviet collectivization. It's still practiced in Kazakhstan today, and modern population genetics research has confirmed what the tradition always promised. Kazakh populations show remarkably high genetic diversity for a historically nomadic people, entirely consistent with centuries of rigorously enforced outbreeding. So let's set the scene. Mid-1600s. On the steppe, a Kazakh elder is reciting 7 generations of ancestors to make sure 2 young people can safely marry. In rural Spain, a groom is carefully rotating his stallions between estates so the foals come out strong. And in the royal Alcázar of Madrid, the King of Spain is marrying his own niece. Which brings us to the real question. How? How did the most powerful, most educated, most resourced dynasty on the continent get this so catastrophically, so repeatedly, so willfully wrong, when literally everyone around them, from their own stable hands to nomads they'd never heard of, already had it figured out? Because they didn't get it wrong. They knew. They chose power anyway. The Habsburg motto tells you everything. Bella gerant alii, tu felix Austria nube. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. That wasn't a joke. It was genuine strategic doctrine. While France and England bled their treasuries fighting wars of conquest, The Habsburgs assembled the largest empire in European history through dynastic unions. Austria, the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, the southern Netherlands, huge chunks of Italy, the Philippines, the entire New World colonial empire. All of it held together by bloodline. All of it vulnerable to being inherited away if a Habsburg married outside the family and the offspring's loyalty split, or the inheritance passed to a rival house. Every marriage was a lock on a door. Every cousin wedding was an insurance policy, keeping the empire inside the family at the cost of keeping the family inside itself. Cold, calculated, cold-blooded. It started gaining real momentum in 1496 when Philip the Handsome married Joanna of Castile, uniting Habsburg lands with the crowns of Castile and Aragon. Their son, Charles V, born 1500, Holy Roman Emperor, ruler of an empire where the sun literally never set, was vigorous, capable, ambitious. His portraits show a mild underbite, just a hint, a warning light on the dashboard that the dynasty decided to ignore. In 1526, Charles V married Isabella of Portugal, his first cousin. The political rationale was airtight: secure the Portuguese alliance, keep Iberian power consolidated. The biological rationale was a flashing red alarm. Nobody blinked. Their son, Philip II, born 1527, inherited Spain, the Netherlands, southern Italy, and the colonial empire. More pronounced jaw than his father. Still functional, still formidable. He married 4 times, and his first wife, Maria Manuela of Portugal, was, say it with me, his first cousin. Another loop in the family tree folding back on itself. She died in 1545, giving birth to their son, Don Carlos, a boy who grew up physically deformed, mentally unstable, and violent. Imprisoned by his own father, dead at 23. Don Carlos was a warning written in human flesh. Philip II saw it, buried his son, kept going. His third marriage in 1570 is the one that should have made every horse breeder in the kingdom scream. He married Anna of Austria, his own niece, his sister Maria's daughter. In the stables of the Escorial, barely a stone's throw from the royal bedchamber, grooms were making sure mares weren't bred to their own sires. Upstairs, the King of Spain was doing exactly what his stable hands knew not to do. Anna and Philip produced Philip III, born 1578, passive, indifferent, jaw getting harder to hide in portraits. Philip III married Margaret of Austria in 1599, another cousin, of course. Their son Philip IV, born 1605, ascended to the throne in 1621 and reigned for 44 years, long enough to watch the dynasty's genetic time bomb start detonating in the nursery. Even Velázquez, one of the greatest painters who ever lived, couldn't fully hide what was happening to Philip IV's face. The jutting lower lip, the elongated skull, the heavy underbite that had become the dynasty's heraldic emblem in flesh. But Philip IV was still intelligent, still cultured, still functioning. His children were not. They died at an appalling rate. Of the many offspring born across his 2 marriages and various relationships, an extraordinary proportion never survived infancy or childhood. His first wife, Elizabeth of France, bore him 8 children. Only 2 reached adulthood. His beloved heir, Balthazar Charles, handsome, promising, the great hope of the dynasty, died in 1646 at 16. The infant mortality rate among the later Spanish Habsburgs hit roughly 50%, vastly higher than even the already brutal baseline of 17th-century childhood death. Philip IV was bearing babies at a rate that any livestock breeder in his kingdom would have recognized instantly. The stock is too close. The blood is too thick. You are killing your own line. And then he made the decision that ended his dynasty. Balthazar Charles had been betrothed to Mariana of Austria, the daughter of Philip's own sister Maria Anna and Emperor Ferdinand III. Mariana was meant to be Philip's daughter-in-law. When the groom died, Philip didn't release the young woman from the Habsburg web. He married her himself. In 1649, she was 14, he was 44. She was his niece. She was also his cousin through multiple other tangled lines. She'd been meant for his son. Let that sit for a second. This man buried his boy, then married the girl his dead son was supposed to wed. A girl who was also his own sister's child, because the alternative, allowing a non-Habsburg into the inheritance, was more unthinkable than anything biology could do to the resulting offspring. 12 years later, on November 6, 1661, the final product of 150 years of compounding genetic catastrophe was born in Madrid. They named him Carlos. History calls him Charles II. And what he was, what they made him, was the most devastating indictment of royal arrogance the human body has ever been forced to deliver. His inbreeding coefficient was 0.254. Let me put that in terms that actually mean something. The expected coefficient for a child born of brother-sister incest is 0.250. Charles II of Spain was more inbred than the theoretical offspring of a sibling mating. Not because his parents were siblings, but because so many generations of intermarriage before them had already compressed the gene pool so brutally that by the time Philip IV and Mariana conceived their son, there was almost no genetic diversity left to draw from. Charles didn't have the normal 8 great-grandparents. He had 4. Joanna of Castile, who lived in the early 1500s, appears in his family tree so many times in different positions that her genetic material was massively amplified instead of diluted, the opposite of what happens in a normal family over 5 or 6 generations. The result was a human being broken before his first breath. Charles couldn't speak clearly until he was 4. He didn't walk until he was nearly 8. He suffered from what contemporaries described as a massive head, likely hydrocephalus, fluid accumulation in the cranial cavity that his frail body could barely support. Epileptic seizures throughout his life, chronic gastrointestinal agony that modern researchers have tentatively linked to possible renal tubular acidosis, a condition where the kidneys fail to properly process acid, plausibly the expression of autosomal recessive genes concentrated by generation after generation of cousin, marrying uncle, marrying niece. He drooled constantly. He was impotent, almost certainly infertile. 2 marriages, no children. The line ended with him. And his face. His face was the final, maximal expression of the dynasty's signature horror. The Habsburg jaw, mandibular prognathism, had been growing more pronounced in every generation of portraits since Maximilian I. In Charles II, it reached its terminal stage. His lower jaw protruded so far beyond his upper jaw that his teeth couldn't meet. The King of Spain, sovereign of an empire stretching from Manila to Mexico City, could not chew his own food. His tongue was so oversized it filled his mouth, further destroying his ability to speak or eat. Foreign ambassadors wrote dispatches that ranged from diplomatic understatement to barely concealed horror. The French ambassador described a man who seemed perpetually on the verge of death. The papal nuncio's reports read like medical case files. But here's what makes it worse, and honestly, this is the part that should make you angry. The portraits lied. The official court paintings of Charles II, produced by artists including Juan Carreño de Miranda, show a pale, thin, somewhat odd-looking young man, with dark eyes and a noticeable but not monstrous jaw. He looks sickly, sure, but fundamentally human. Now compare those canvases to the written accounts, the drooling, the inability to chew, the oversized head. speech so garbled his own courtiers couldn't understand their king, and the gap between image and reality becomes an act of propaganda. Those painters weren't just flattering their patron the way all court painters flatter. They were actively concealing the visible, physical proof that the dynasty's marriage strategy had produced a genetic catastrophe. 17th-century airbrushing. And it worked. For centuries, the public's image of Charles II was shaped by these softened portraits, the true scale of his deformity underestimated until modern researchers began cross-referencing the painted record with contemporary written descriptions. In April 2009, Gonzalo Alvarez, Francisco C. Ceballos, and Celsa Quintero of the University of Santiago de Compostela published a landmark study in PLOS I, The Role of Inbreeding in the Extinction of a European Royal Dynasty, that ripped the veil away for good, constructing a massive genealogical database and quantifying the exact inbreeding coefficients across the entire dynasty. The numbers confirmed what the ambassador's letters had described and the portraits had hidden. The Habsburgs didn't just decline. They engineered their own extinction. When Charles II died on November 1st, 1700, 6 days before his 39th birthday, the autopsy reportedly found his body contained not a single drop of blood, his heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, his intestines rotten and gangrenous. He had a single testicle black as coal, and his head was full of water. That description likely reflects the medical limitations and dramatic conventions of 1700s autopsy reporting. But even accounting for exaggeration, the clinical picture is staggering. This was a body that had never been given a fair chance. And you want to know how extreme this family tree really was? Someone tried to recreate it in The Sims 4. They attempted to build Habsburg-style intermarriage within the game's genealogy system. The family tree visualization broke. The software couldn't render the recursive loops of an ancestry that folds back on itself instead of branching outward. The genealogy display collapsed into an incomprehensible tangle because the programmers had never imagined anyone would try to build a family where everyone is everyone else's cousin, uncle, nephew, and grandchild simultaneously. A video game, designed to simulate human life, crashed trying to model what the Habsburgs did on purpose for a century and a half. Let that sink in. A Kazakh nomad knew better. A pig farmer knew better. A video game knew better. And if you think this is just ancient history, something safely locked in the past, it isn't. First cousin marriage is still legal in multiple U.S. states right now. Not some obscure legal oversight nobody's noticed. States including California, New York, Colorado, and others permit it outright. No restrictions. Some states, like Arizona and Illinois, allow it, with conditions. Only if the couple is over a certain age or can prove they can't reproduce. The patchwork of American cousin marriage law is genuinely bizarre, varying wildly from state to state with no federal standard. We look at the Habsburgs and call them idiots. We look at their deformed children and feel righteous horror. And then we go home to a country where the same category of union is still perfectly legal in a significant number of states. But I don't want to end there. I want to go back to Charles, because here's what every video about the Habsburgs risks getting wrong: making Charles II the punchline when he should be the plaintiff. He didn't choose this. He didn't negotiate his parents' marriage. He didn't draw up the contracts that turned his family tree into a circle. He was born into a body that 150 years of political ambition had systematically wrecked, and he spent 38 years trapped inside it, unable to eat properly, unable to speak clearly, unable to produce an heir, unable to do the one thing his entire existence was supposed to justify. Every foreign court whispered about him. Every ambassador reported on his grotesque appearance while accepting his hospitality. Every portrait painter lied about his face while he sat there, drooling, knowing what he looked like, knowing what they were hiding. He never asked to be born into this. He was the final receipt for 150 years of a family that loved power more than their own children. And somewhere, while Charles II sat on his throne unable to chew his own dinner, a stable hand in his own kingdom was quietly making sure the horses bred right. The stable boy knew better than every king in Europe. Subscribe for more stories like this.